We look at the Chapter 9 institutions. These institutions are provided for in the Constitution and are set to form a cornerstone to the sustenance of democracy and other democratic principles. Now, how can we use these institutions as mechanisms to strengthen our democracy, to promote human rights, to seek solutions to our socio-economic crisis, and to foster social cohesion? Joining us on the line, Jan Hofmeyr, head of the Policy and Analysis Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. Good evening to you, Mr. Hofmeyr, and thank you so much for joining us. Welcome onto the Talk Shop.
Good evening, Mr. Chaba, and thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you with us, sir. In terms of awareness around the Chapter 9 institutions in South Africa, how aware are South Africans?
I think there's a relatively low level of awareness that South Africans have, and I think part of it has to do with the lack of prominence that I think the state is giving to these institutions. And we've actually had a number of years ago an investigation and a parliamentary inquiry under the former and the late Minister Kader Asmal, actually about how we can enhance the roles that they're supposed to play. Unfortunately, that report has been gathering dust, and I think it's quite unfortunate because, as you mentioned in your introduction, these institutions are really there to support democratic values, but also those values that are pronounced within the South African Constitution.
What are some of the recommendations, Mr. Hofmeyr, that are contained in the Kader Asmal report?
Well, in very broad terms, it was that these committees or these commissions deserve much more prominence and also much more powers, and also, very importantly, funding to execute their mandate. And if one looks, for example, at the Human Rights Commission, which is really a pertinent institution in a country such as South Africa with a history like ours. But if one looks at the funding that such an institution receives, it is really dismal, and their resources are really stretched. So the impact that this has is that many people who go to the Human Rights Commission, and I'm taking it just as one example, is that people might go there, they might find that the resources available to the Commission is not really there to investigate each sort of issue that needs to be investigated. And in the longer term, people might lose trust and confidence in these institutions, and more broadly also in the institutions of the state and democracy in general in South Africa.
But we're talking about ensuring that they have the resources, that they have the skills, the manpower needed to make them functional. But we're seeing other Chapter 9 institutions excelling despite these challenges, if one can put it that way.
Well, I think if one sort of generally looks, the one that really has stood out over the past 2 or 3 years has been that the Office of the Public Protector. I mean, she has played a sort of a very prominent role, I think, also sort of in challenging sort of government departments, where I think her predecessor, Mr. Mushwana, was much more, I think, sort of docile in approach. I would not say less assertive, but I think we've seen much less assertiveness through towards the specific mandate. And I think this is a good thing because it shows that it's a state that is working. It's a state that acts, but it's also being kept in check by institutions of the state and institutions of governance. I think another Chapter 9 institution that plays a pivotal role is that of the Auditor General, for example, which is also critical. But one would like to see institutions like the Human Rights Commission also receiving a much sort of stronger resource base with which they can act. Because I think one must remember that many South Africans, millions of South Africans, don't really have direct sort of access to the state or remedies when they feel that their rights are being sort of affected. And at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, we also do an annual public opinion survey where we engage a number of issues related to governance and also trust in institutions, for example. And one of the interesting findings is that although South Africans generally trust government to do what is right, or the state to do what is right, only 50% of South Africans feel that the state or the leaders of the country do not really care about people like them. So there is definitely a sense of distance between the bureaucracy and ordinary citizens, and that needs to be bridged. And I think it's very important that institutions, Chapter 9 institutions specifically, like the Gender Commission, the Human Rights Commission, and so on, that they fill that gap that exists between the two.
When we talk about Chapter 9 institutions, the issue of accountability also comes into play. And when one looks at the Office of the Auditor General, the Office of the Public Protector, and the Electoral Commission to a large extent, one sees, how these commissions or institutions hold government accountable. But I think it becomes a bit blurred when it comes to the Human Rights Commission, the CRL, that is the Commission for the Rights of Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Communities, and even for the Commission for Gender Equality. It becomes a bit blurred in terms of people understanding exactly how these organizations these Chapter 9 institutions hold government accountable.
Yes, and I think this is especially where the role of proper sort of government communications is really critical, and I think it's again a resource question of how do these organizations sort of publish themselves, make themselves known to ordinary South Africans. Because if you think of it, I think in the past couple of years we've seen a number of court cases, high-profile court cases, that I think polarized the country. There was, for example, the whole question of struggle songs, the whole kill the boer, kill the farmer, sort of struggle song, which went to a court, and I think in the process what it did polarized constituencies on both sides of it. But I think if something like this was dealt properly with something, through a Chapter 9 institution, we could have averted it, and we could have come up with a much more sort of constructive sort of solution to the problem. And so what happens quite often is that South Africans go to court to resolve their institutions, and which very often result in a very polarized outcome, whereas these institutions can really help us also forge the kind of society that we really need without the conflict.
But isn't it also a case, Mr. Hofmeyr, of, the courts being very clear with regards to what is legal and what is not legal? And whereas these Chapter 9 institutions, specifically the Human Rights Commission, the CRL Commission, as well as the Commission for Gender Equality, are very much not looking at right or wrong. They will always be in the middle in terms of there will always be some sectors of society that say, no, this is wrong, and others saying, no, this is right. And it becomes very, very difficult for them to then, proclaim that this is the case, this is right, and this is wrong. And again, it goes back to the issue of then we get further polarized because there are no right or wrong answers in the issues that they deal with.
I fully agree. I mean, these institutions are also subject to the rule of law. But I would like to sort of argue that the judicial sort of outcomes or court pronouncements very often have the impact sort of polarizing. It's almost as if there always has to be a winner or a loser. And, I think the other impact that these sort of very high-profile cases have on court is that they divide society. And I think what is critical, specifically only 20 years after, we've made the transition from an illegitimate regime with an illegitimate judicial system, is that we also instill trust and confidence in our courts. But if we constantly expect of our courts to make rulings about very polarizing issues. We sometimes stand, the chance of, developing a court system in which some people would trust and others weren't because they were regarded as biased. And I think if one really wants to have a society where the rule of law is predominant, one also needs a system or a judicial system that everybody has confidence in. And therefore, I would argue that one first has to go through the layer that the Constitution provides us with these institutions to mediate conflicts that exist within society.
The Human Rights Commission has been looking at the issue of decent ablution facilities for South Africans, and they have really found the situation shocking. But that was the end of it. One didn't hear more from them with regards to what is the way forward, and even if there will be any penalties incurred on those who have not fulfilled their mandate or have not delivered the services required. Do you think that this is one of the challenges of the Chapter 9 institutions, that we hear about the investigations that they've undertaken, but then it ends there and there doesn't seem to be a resolution or even a recommendation with regards to a way forward that has teeth, not just a recommendation that says we recognize that you have not been fulfilling your duties, please do so, but that says we will punish you in this way if you continue to ignore your mandate.
Yeah, I think one has to look at what the specific mandate of a specific institution is. So, I think on the one hand it is important to look at that mandate and also look at what the recommendations were by the Hofmeyr Commission, and certainly it did recommend far more sort of powers that give it far more sort of assertiveness in that regard. But I think one also has to look at the other side, and that's the extent to which governments, national and provincial, pay attention to these recommendations. I think that's a very good example of the one that you've just mentioned, the whole question of sanitation and ablution. But the question of the public protector's report on Kandla, for example, as well, as another example, where one has to ask, what is the use of having such institutions that are constitutionally mandated, who develop reports and make recommendations, and they're being ignored? I think what it does is it does undermine the legitimacy of the institutions, but it also undermines trust of ordinary people in the system of governance. So I think this is sort of has got two sides to it. The one relates specifically to the mandate and whether the proper institution executes its mandate, but the other is also whether governments at the various levels actually abide by these recommendations and respect them.
We're talking to the head of the Policy and Analysis Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, Jan Hofmeyr. We're talking about Chapter 9 institutions in South Africa and their role as institutional watchdogs of our democracy.
SAFM brings you live, interactive, topical news from current affairs, global warming debates, women's issues, to interviews with top literary connoisseurs. To join our conversations, visit our website on safm.co.za. Follow us on Twitter at SAFM Radio, or simply like our Facebook page, SAFM Radio. SAFM, South Africa's news and information leader.
Yesterday was Nurses' Day, and if you've ever spent any time in a hospital or clinic, you would know how hard these individuals work. It is often a thankless job with long hours and little reward. So you really have to have a passion for looking after people who are too sick to care for themselves. Coming up in Corin Key's Health Matters show later this evening at 9:05, we talk to Neo Khauwe, who is the General Manager of the Polmed Business Unit at Metropolitan Health. Neo is a former nurse, so she will be here to tell us firsthand about what got her into nursing and just what it takes to be a nurse in South Africa today.
The Talk Shop.
This is the Talk Shop on SAFM 104 to 107. I am Masichaba Mdolo, and we're talking to Jan Hofmeyr, head of the Policy and Analysis Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, on our talkback session tonight. And we're looking at Chapter 9 institutions and their role as institutional watchdogs of our democracy. We are taking the calls on 0891 104 207, 0891 104 207, or you can SMS us on 34701. SMS number is 34701, and SMSs are charged at R2. We are looking at Chapter 9 institutions. I've got an SMS coming in that says Chapter 9 institutions, particularly the public protector, don't offer much protection to whistleblowers. Why is that? And that's coming in from Bertram Bird. Jan?
Yes. Well, I think we do have sufficient sort of whistleblower legislation in South Africa. I think we really sort of stand out as one of the countries that has really provided for it. But I think sort of as in many instances, in South Africa, but I think in many other states as well, there is a gap between sort of the implementation of that legislation and the actual letter of the law. And it is quite unfortunate that this is the case, especially sort of in a country where we have seen sort of a proliferation of corruption, not only in government departments but also in the private sector. Mm-hmm. And I think this makes it really critical that the enforcement is really sharpened in that regard.
And talking about enforcement, earlier on you spoke about one of the recommendations in the Kader Asmal report being to give more power to the Chapter 9 institutions. I mean, I was talking to the outgoing CEO of the CRL Commission, and they were talking about the frustrations that they are having in terms of getting publishers, that is those in the private sector, to actually start printing and publishing books in the indigenous languages. The work has been done by the CRL. They've got various publications that they've compiled, that they've done research on, but they're not getting any joy in terms of getting the private sector to come on board. And this talks about this being a national effort. Am I correct here? It's not just about these Chapter 9 institutions holding government accountable, but it talks about building a South Africa where there is social cohesion, where we're talking about, relatively balanced socio-economic conditions.
No, exactly. It should be a national effort. Unfortunately, I think what one sees is that these decisions are largely market-driven. Mm-hmm. That publishers sort of make the sums, and I think in many instances feel that the demand is not there. But I think that's sort of also then very important also for government to step in as far as funding is concerned, because I think this is really contributing to the national sort of fiber of our state. This is an investment that may not necessarily be tangible in rands and cents and tangible infrastructure, but this is a longer-term investment into the social fiber of our country. And if we sometimes sort of ask why we don't understand each other in South Africa, why we talk past each other, and also the impact that this has on commercial decisions, I think one has to go and look for the answers in very simple places like these.
But it talks about implementation, and I think it goes back to what you were saying around legislation protecting whistleblowers and it being about the implementation of it. Can the Chapter 9 institutions utilize the courts in order to get to ease or even facilitate the work that they're supposed to be doing?
They can. In terms of the mandate that they receive, they can do that. Again, I think the question is whether they do have the resources to do that. an institution like the Human Rights Commission, whether they can afford to constantly sort of litigate. It's also a question of the distribution of resources. But, I think if one just holds up the budget of these different institutions and you compare it, for example, with what our national budget for sport is, not that sport is not important and that the physical development of young people is important. But if you compare these budgets, you really have to ask yourself sort of where do our priorities lie?
But do we need all of these Chapter 9 institutions, Jan? I mean, when one looks at the Commission for Gender Equality and one looks at the Ministry for Women, Children and People with Disabilities and the work that they're doing in terms of gender equality, is this not a duplication? And they also, that ministry is also complaining about lack of funding, about lack of resources in order to, enable them to fulfill their mandate.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a valid question whether some of these institutions cannot be merged to become entities which are better resourced and also maybe better sort of targeted. But I think one cannot sort of compare sort of a ministry for women and children with a gender commission, because the gender commission is supposed to provide oversight, provide access to ordinary South Africans, and also a remedy when they feel that their rights are being sort of impacted upon by government and also elsewhere in society. So I think one must keep that separate, the difference between oversight institution and ministry. But your question with regard to whether there is a potential to merge some of these institutions, I think that has got merit and it has also been investigated.
And the educational elements of the Chapter 9 institutions, who is supposed to do that and who is doing that? Is that currently taking place? I'm thinking of, you talk about the role of the Commission for Gender Equality, and there are not many South Africans who are aware of how the Commission can assist them. I mean, I think the last time the Commission received the prominence that the Public Protector is getting at the moment is when women came back from Beijing. And we were talking 50-50, and that seemed to be that's it fizzled out, and there's not much talk around what the Commission for Gender Equality is doing and the conditions of women in South Africa today.
Yes, well, these institutions are responsible also for their own image within society, and I think part of it definitely has to do with budget, the way that they sort of allocate the resources, and also the extent to which they are successful in making themselves visible within society. But I think if one specifically looks towards the Public Protector, one has also seen sort of an individual that has sort of really risen sort of also sort of above, or not above her institution, but she has really become sort of a very prominent public personality, and it's because she is outspoken. She has an image within society as being courageous, and this is also sort of what we also have seen in our own public opinion findings. So it much also has to do with the leadership within these institutions and the extent to which they are being seen as standing up for the ordinary person.
I'm looking at some of the SMSs coming in. One says the PSC, that's the Peace and Security Council, is investigating better protection of whistleblowers. We'll get into that in our next discussion because that is what we will be looking at, the African Union's Peace and Security Council marking their 10th anniversary. Another SMS says, I think our democracy can be intensified if only our youth can read Chapter 9 and understand it, but the challenge is when it has to be implemented, especially to our leaders. That's coming in from Simon Moloto at Malukela. And that's been one of the concerns that's been raised, Jan, has it not? That, yes, the Chapter 9 institutions are doing the best that they can in their respective fields, but it seems that even leadership, even the leaders themselves, do not understand fully what the role of the Chapter 9 institutions is.
Yes, I think sometimes one gets the impression that some, within leadership positions regard them as a nuisance, as interfering in areas where they feel that these institutions do not have any business, and I think that is a problem. When one looks at the state is not sort of only governed, but is also being kept in place by checks and balances that would exist within society. And I think for ordinary people to extend legitimacy to the state, they also have to have the confidence that they have got remedies whenever they feel that their rights have been impeded upon, or when they feel that they're not being treated fairly. If they don't feel that they've got these remedies, people tend to take sort of actions that can be described as extra legal. One see people being frustrated and destroy public property because they feel this is the only way that they can make themselves heard. Now, I think if politicians have a proper understanding of the potential role that these institutions can play in also dealing with these social tensions, one would see much less of those very desperate actions sometimes. I think in some instances criminal, but in most instances very desperate actions to get the attention of politicians to find a remedy for this situation.
And the issue of accountability obviously always coming into play, and the question being asked, but why are we so critical of government today when we look back at some of the atrocities that were committed under the apartheid government? They seem to have gotten away with much more. Maybe can we look at that? Earlier on you asked the question, a lot people are asking, but why do we need these Chapter 9 institutions? And I would like to extend that and say, looking at where we come from and some of those atrocities that were committed under the apartheid regime, how do Chapter 9 institutions sustain accountability and show up accountability to make sure that we never find ourselves back in those days again when government just acted with impunity?
Yeah, I think a very critical role these institutions have to play is to help us find a new sort of normative approach to governance, one that did not exist under apartheid. Under apartheid, we've seen sort of a very authoritative top-down system which did not hesitate to oppress when it saw the need to do so. And we have to move away from that kind of approach which sees government as the ruler, citizen merely as the subject. Because we definitely live in a different dispensation. We do not have these atrocities of the past. But I think one should be careful that one do not sort of inherit the impression that government is the ruler, citizen is subject, and they must merely sort of wait for government to deliver, or sit passively when they feel that their rights are being sort of impacted upon. And therefore, I think Chapter 9 institutions play that very critical role that should help us to change the normative values of the state that we live in, that people also feel empowered to act and to say, no, you can't allow this, you can't do this to us, this is not what the Constitution promises us or what the Constitution expresses on certain issues.
I want to take Njabulo in Midrand. Good evening to you, Njabulo.
Hi, Mr. Rawi.
I'm very well, thank you, Dad.
Thanks for taking my call.
Thank you for calling in.
I think this is a very relevant discussion in this time around. And the contribution I wanted to make was to say first it would be very important for us to separate between core Chapter 9 institutions and Chapter 8 institutions in the form of the judiciary. So the first point. And I'm really saying this because we as a society have got our own way of defining these institutions, particularly the Chapter 9 institutions. For instance, you would see the poster that the public protector has taken, the current public protector. It's a different poster than that taken by the former public protector, who is currently now the Human Rights Commissioner. And the contribution that media made in terms of encouraging these institutions to take the posters that they do, are we as the society happy to risk them fighting with government? Because my understanding is that they form part of a governance, of a broader governance framework in the country, particularly from a complementary role in government, where they need to define their objectivity and independence is, whoever they deal with, they need to be independent and objective. Whether it's government, whether it's the public, but their role in the society is complementary in the entire governance framework in the country. And I'm saying this because they receive their funding from government. That's the first one. Secondly, their officials are appointed by one arm of government, either be the executive or whoever, but they get appointed in that perspective. Now, if we as society are encouraging them to take a posture that seeks to be against, or that seeks to encourage confrontation between them and government, we could extract a lot of value if they complement the broader government framework in our country. And I thought I should throw that into the discussion for us to look at.
Thank you very much for the call. Jan?
I think that's such an important point. I think one of the very unfortunate things that we've seen in our media is that it has, especially as far as the public protector is concerned, it has sort of portrayed a picture of the public protector against government, or public protector against the state. There has always been that subtext, and that is, I think it's very harmful for governance in general, because as your caller rightly pointed out, these institutions are there to complement each other. And the more that this view is being reinforced, I think the more hardened these sort of positions will become between different institutions, and this should not be the case. And I think therefore one also has to look towards the media and say, that one has to report responsibly on issues relating to Chapter 9 institutions.
But are we not seeing elements of government itself using the Chapter 9 institutions to fight their wars, or to push their relevant agendas of the day? I mean, we have heard time and time again of a party like the DA, for example, that will say, we'll take this to court, and we are taking it back to court, we're appealing it, or even we have referred this matter to the public protector, and this seems to be the call of the day, that if you want somebody to call government to order, to call the ruling party to order, so to speak, then just stick a Chapter 9 institution on them.
Yes, well, I think we've heard sort of a number of those sort of accusations. I think it has also got to do with our party politic dynamics in South Africa, where you have one party that has got sort of an absolute majority, and in many instances opposition parties stand very little chance to get their way as far as certain issues are concerned. And then they would typically either resort to a Chapter 9 institution such as the public protector, or to the courts, which again I think is also sort of unfortunate, because one do not really want to have government by courts. You want sort of government sort of through sort of an elected sort of party system. Unfortunately, I think that's part of our dynamic, and therefore one would also hope for a much more consensual kind of politics in South Africa that is not so polarized as it's just been up to now.
I've got an SMS coming in from Willie in Stilfontein. He says the this watchdog itself does not protect the public protector against the ANC loyalists who would resist plain truths and call her names. And we've seen attacks on the public protector, and a lot of discussion has happened around the person who is leading the institution and the institution itself, and the legitimacy of the institution, and what it means for it to be challenged in a way that sees the attack on the person leading it. How do we resolve such issues, Jan? And do you think that we will resolve them in the near future? Are these part of the teething problems of a solid democracy?
I think so. If one speaks specific now about the public protector, I think it's the first time that we've had a public protector that comes over as assertive as the current public protector. I think what has been unfortunate is the name calling that one has seen in the past. I think sort of certain forms of victimization. I think those things does not belong in a democracy such as ours, and also a democracy that sets as high standards as we do for ourselves. But I think the flip side of the coin is also, I think one must also remember that these are institutions that are fallible, and they're also not beyond reproach, also not the individuals that head these institutions. So I think what is important is, again, not to polarize the institution in a way that there are those who would blindly follow and believe anything that a head of an institution says, like the public protector, and then on the other side, those that blindly discredit everything that she says. So the institution itself also has to create its own integrity through its conduct. And therefore the institution and the person who heads the institution is not beyond reproach. But it is, I think, our responsibility as citizens, but also political parties, to show the necessary deference and respect to the institution.
But how then do we get that balance right, especially in light of the comment from our caller in Midrand, who said, let's not forget that these Chapter 9 institutions are funded by government, and therefore we would expect that they play a complementary role to the governance of the country rather than an adversarial role. How do they get it right? Because there are times when they will need to be adversarial. They will need to say, no, we're calling you to account because you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing as government. How do they walk that fine line?
I think one has seen a number of instances where this has already happened. But again, I think it's a question also of trial and error. And also, I think the assertiveness of these institutions themselves. If there is a perception within the institutions that their role is merely complementary, I think one might run into trouble that these institutions do not assert themselves, and people would not want to make use of them. But I think in the longer term, sort of as they evolve, and through trial and error, one will see sort of where the necessary balance lies. But one must remember they're relatively young institutions.
Mm-hmm. I've got an interesting SMS that's coming in from JPE, and JPE again goes back to the issue of the funding and the appointing and the separation of power. And he says, surely while the president can appoint the Chief Justice, the head of the NPA, the SAPS, etc., there can be no separation of power.
Well, it's a Judicial Service Committee that really makes the recommendations to the President. So it is a consultative process that is not only the pejorative of the President itself. And I think also, these appointments are being made, but I think thus far we have seen that none of the appointments have been sort of overtly party loyalists, and I think we have seen a significant degree sort of oversight, especially in the recent years, especially as far as the Auditor General is concerned, the Independent Electoral Commission as well, and in recent years also the public protector. So I do not think that there is much of a problem with the procedure around appointment. I think it is much more to do with ethos, mandate, and also the resources that are behind these institutions.
And there's also a clear separation of powers, regardless of how the appointments are made.
The Constitution provides for that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. An absolute pleasure talking to you, Jan Hofmeyr, head of the Policy and Analysis Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, looking at Chapter 9 institutions and their role as institutional watchdogs of our democracy. Really appreciate your time, sir. We're moving on now, and we're talking